The subject of my presentation are the last years of the Hochschule Library. My aim is twofold. First, I want to fill an existing gap, because there are many things we don't yet know about the Hochschule Library in general and this last period in particular. Second, I will attempt to answer a question that arose with some urgency when I started taking a closer look at the last years of the Hochschule Library myself, namely, which actually are the last years of the Hochschule Library. You will have noticed that the title of my presentation is referencing the title of a paper by Herbert Strauss. 30 years ago, Strauss wrote about the last years of the Hochschule in an edited volume about the Wissenschaft des Judentums. In that paper, he covered the period of 1936 to 1942. To Strauss, the matter was clear. Since he was one of the last students of the Hochschule, the end began in 1936, when he enrolled to study at the Hochschule, while 1942 brought the definite end to the Hochschule, when the last Jewish educational institutions in Germany were forced to close. I argue, in case of the library of the Hochschule, its last years cannot be determined that easily. In the following, I intend to shed light on the Hochschule Library during the last period of the Hochschule's existence, as well as on its fate following its confiscation. To do so, I will utilize the traces of usage and ownership found in the resurfaced books to bridge the gap left by archival sources. Here on display, where Jana Blechschmidt is sitting on the table, are 3 books from the Hochschule Library. I invite you to have a closer look at them during the next coffee break. For the moment, and for our Zoom participants, I prepared some photos that will have to do. Next slide, please. These 3 books were part of a collection that in the end, after 70 years of collecting, contained about 60,000 volumes. It was one of the most important Jewish libraries in pre-war Germany. 2 of the 3 books pertain to the subject of religion. One is about the book Esther by the Protestant scholar Hermann Gunkel. The second is a translation from English into German of a work about the Torah. The third book is an introduction into the Hebrew language written in German and published in Jerusalem in 1904. These books are covered with traces. In the course of my presentation, I will walk you through these traces and their meaning. Some of them are provenance marks, pointing towards the former owners of the books or the spaces that they passed through on their way to us. Some of the traces are processing marks. Next slide, please. Here, for example, you see the shelf marks of the Hochschule Library. Usually, they are placed in the upper left corner of the inside of the cover. All 3 of them have been crossed out, but they are still legible. Additionally to the shelf marks, these books carry the stamp of the Hochschule Library. You can usually find the Hochschule stamp on the title page of the books. Next slide, please. The shape, color, and text of the stamp can vary, reflecting both the changes of the name of the institution as well as the changes of fashions over the decades of activity of the library. Next to the stamp, usually on the lower half of the title page, you will find an item number that we attribute to the Hochschule Library. These processing marks are created in the course of library routine. They distinguish one book from the other. They were complemented by a catalogue. Remarkably, this catalogue of the Hochschule was younger than the collection, because after moving to the new building in 1907, the board of the Hochschule decided that it was time to set up a new state-of-the-art catalogue. This meant 2 things. Firstly, the catalogue was set up according to the so-called Prussian instructions. Following the same set of rules for cataloguing as other Prussian libraries, allowed the library to participate in a network of interlibrary loan. Thus, it helped providing the readers at the Hochschule with the books they needed. Secondly, the catalogue was created not as a bound volume, but as a card catalogue. This was much more convenient for the librarians, but also for the readers, who had to rely on the catalogue to find what they were looking for, since browsing the shelves was not an option. Except for the reference works and periodicals available in the reading room, each book had to be ordered and was retrieved by library staff. The great disadvantage of a catalogue like this is, of course, that there is usually only one copy. If that is gone, it is gone. We saw in the case of the Freimann collection not only the importance of a catalogue for the collection, but also how the fate of the collection hinged on the fact that this catalogue had been published and was widely available. Creating a new catalogue for the Hochschule collection meant recataloguing the complete old stock. We can get an idea of how tedious, how unexpectedly tedious this process was if we follow the recataloguing project through the different volumes of the annual report. The recataloguing was started in 1910. The plan was to complete the project within 3 years. This plan turned out to be far too ambitious. The project finally came to completion only in 1928. One of the results of the project was that for the first time the library was able to report an exact number of volumes, not an estimate. Overall, it can be said that this period was a period of professionalization for the library. This explicitly includes the people taking care of the collection, because for the first time it is actually trained librarians working in the library. Up until then, it had been the job of scholars of the discipline, like David Kassel or Moses Barol, who managed the library additionally to their other obligations. This shift had two effects. First, this meant that the opportunities for leaving a personal mark on the organization of the collection decreased. To reply here to one of the many questions that you raised here yesterday, Caroline. Second, the shift meant that for the first time we see women working in the library. These women are Jenny Wilde, Adele Sperling, Jenny Dörfler and Suse Hallenstein. While much more research needs to be done on Wilde, Sperling and Dörfler, I'm very happy that we will be hearing more about Suse Hallenstein from Irene Münster directly after my presentation. Especially the case of Suse Hallenstein made it clear to me how important it is to include into our examination of the intellectual legacy of the Hochschule not only its surviving scholars, but the staff of the Hochschule too. This period of professionalization of work at the Hochschule Library stands in stark contrast to the following one, the last period. The following years are characterized by A lack of funds, B, an extraordinary growth of the size of the collection, and C, a steadily growing number of readers. Before, eventually, the collection was confiscated. To meet the rising demand, the library workers fell back on makeshift solutions. The economic hardships that the Hochschule faced in these years extended to the library too. In 1935, for example, the Jahresbericht reports that there hadn't been any funds available at all for new acquisitions. Nevertheless, we observe a steep incline of the size of collection in number of volumes in the 1930s. Next slide, please. This incline is caused by the donation of collections. Donations that are gladly accepted exactly because of the lack of funds. However, while the library had relied on the donation of books since its establishment, these donations were different. These collections had been left behind by refugees. The result of this development from a librarian's practical point of view was that, I quote, the collection grew fringes. This means the extraordinary growth of these years is accompanied by the incorporation of more and more non-relevant books. At the same time, the growth led to a storage problem. The library ran out of space. Initially, the library occupied the 3rd and 4th floor of the Hochschule building. However, in 1940, parts of the book collection could also be found in the basement, in the attic, and in the so-called teacher's room. In the words of the before-mentioned practical librarian, the Hochschule library was in a state of a Babylonian chaos. And nevertheless, the library was open and continued to offer its services to its readers. Remarkably enough, because as far as we know in the moment, already by the end of 1939, all the other important and less important Jewish public libraries in Germany had been destroyed or confiscated, leaving the Hochschule library as the last one operating. It seems the Hochschule staff was very aware of their precarious situation. after the attempt had failed to transfer the Hochschule and its library stock abroad, they came up with a plan to save at least the most important works of the collection. In 1940, Jenny Wilde, the last head of the library, together with Heinrich Weitz-Simon and Hans-Erich Fabian, handed over 60 books of the collection to Alexander Gutmann. Gutmann successfully smuggled them out of Germany and took them with him to Cincinnati, where they were safely preserved. Meanwhile, teaching at the Hochschule resumed and the library continued its activities. In 1941, when the Hochschule was forced to sell the building, teaching and administration was moved, first to the building of the former Rabbiner Seminar and then to Kantstraße. The book stock, however, stayed behind in Artilleriestraße. And even under these conditions, while the Hochschule staff does not even have free access to their building anymore, but instead needs to ask permission from the Gestapo, 2 cases are documented that prove that the library was still in use. The last activity of the Hochschule library was recalling all borrowed books and then registering their return. The last book was returned in October 1942. That is 3 months after the Hochschule itself had already been closed. And eventually, even though delayed, also the Hochschule library was confiscated and incorporated into the library of the Reichssecurity Main Office. The library of the Reichssecurity Main Office was comprised of looted Jewish libraries, both from Germany as well as from other countries. Its purpose was to provide research literature for the staff of its department for so-called ideological research and evaluation. Among the various German institutions for the anti-Semitic study of Jewish history, the Library of Security Service stands out for 2 reasons. These are its size and the employment of Jewish slave laborers. Due to the fact that the SD librarians had access to the police force, they amassed in Berlin a book collection of enormous extent. To help making this heap of books usable, the SD librarians used Jewish forced laborers. A total of about 100 persons were forced to process, sort and catalogue the stolen books for the security service. This processing of the Hochschule books in order to incorporate them into the Reichssecurity Main Office library left traces. Next slide, please. The most obvious trace is the new shelf mark the books were assigned. You can find it in 2 places. It can be written in pencil on the inside of the front cover. Here you can see that one of my examples is half covered by a paper label. Furthermore, the shelf mark of the Reichssecurity Main Office can be found written in ink on a paper label that was pasted on the back spine of the book. It was forced laborers who left these traces of processing inside these books. A less obvious processing mark can be found in the very back of the books. Next slide, please. What you see here are residues of glue and paper labels. We assume at this point that this is what is left of paper slips that carried the Hochschule's shelf mark. Since these paper slips were long enough to stick out of the book itself, they were called booktails, Bücherschwänze. In absence of backspine labels, these booktails served to identify the books on the shelf. When the Hochschule books were incorporated into the library of the Reichssecurity Main Office, these identifiers became useless because the JB labels replaced them. Therefore, we assume that it was at this point that the booktails were torn out. Moving the books from the Hochschule building the short distance to the headquarters of Department 7 of the Reichssecurity Main Office in the south of Berlin was only the beginning of the translocation of the collection. Not even a year after its confiscation, the main part of the collection was shipped to depots in Silesia and northern Bohemia, while a part of the collection remained in Berlin. These are the places where the stolen books ended the war. To learn more about the post-war transfers of the salvaged books, I invite you to join us later today for the presentation of Anna Holzer-Kawalko. For now, it must suffice to briefly draw your attention to the paper label of the organization Jewish Cultural Reconstruction that can be found in all 3 books on display. Next slide, please. The task of the JCR was to redistribute the books that Nazi persecution had left without an owner or an heir to the new centers of Jewish life. And this is what they did. On the end paper on the right-hand side, you can see our stamp, the stamp of the Leo Baeck Institute Jerusalem. So far, we have identified 25 different institutions that preserve Hochschule books today, the LBI Jerusalem being just one of them. To summarize these developments using spatial imagery, while the Hochschule Library had served as a pool for other collections since its establishment, we can observe a drastic acceleration of the concentrating of other book collections in the Hochschule Library under the rising pressure of persecution. In a similar movement, the library of the Reich Security Main Office concentrated Jewish libraries in Berlin, in the end swallowing the Hochschule Library too. The incorporation of the Hochschule Library into the library of the Reich Security Main Office meant translocating it, first only from one to another Berlin neighborhood, and then splitting of the holdings between Berlin and Silesia and Northern Bohemia. Consequently, however, the main bulk of translocations was done after the war, in the 80 years that have passed since. So, to get back to my initial question, at what point of this trajectory did the Hochschule Library actually end? The end of the Hochschule Library did not come at the same time with the end of the Hochschule. We saw that it survived the Hochschule by at least 3 months. Neither did its end come, as Dorf-Schidorsky proposed, when it was incorporated into the library of the Reich Security Main Office at the end of 1942. To support my claim, I present 2 arguments. First, it is true that the incorporation into a hostile collection environment, as you called it so vividly, Caroline, meant reducing the Hochschule collection to a fragment of its original size and recataloguing and reclassifying what was left. However, I argue not only is every collection always a fragment and the attempt to achieve completeness vain, but in this case, we have even seen concrete evidence that the Sammlungszusammenhang, the inner coherence of a collection, was already lost before the incorporation because of the many donations received under the pressure of the persecutions of the benefactors to the Hochschule Library. Furthermore, it is true that theoretically speaking, recataloguing and reclassifying mean subjecting the object under another order of knowledge. However, practically, this process means not more than writing a new call number onto the object. In our case, for example, the old call numbers are still clearly visible. They allow us to reconstruct the Hochschule classification scheme, which is one of the things we are currently working on. Next slide, please. Much more work still needs to be done, but let me share our first observations with you. We do know a basic distinction into subject headings from the annual reports. For example, in 1911, the collection featured the following subjects: biblische Wissenschaften, halachische Literatur, Literatur des Judentums, Geschichte des Judentums, moderne Judenfrage, neuhebräische Literatur, Orientalia, Philosophie und Allgemeines, Christentum, Systematik und Geschichte, praktische Theologie, Schulberichte und Verwaltungsberichte, Zeitschriften. However, the known shelf marks prove that the classification scheme must have been much more elaborate than this list suggests. Until this point, we could not determine if the Hochschule took inspiration from another classification scheme, but I will be happy to keep you updated on our progress. After this short excursion into classification questions, let's now get back to the question why the Hochschule Library did not end when it was incorporated into the Reich Security Main Office. A second argument focusing on purpose and usage of the stolen books supports my claim even stronger, I think. It is true that the collection was stolen and subjected to a different purpose than intended by its rightful owners. It was stolen to serve the anti-Semitic study of Jewish history. However, that is not the only purpose that the stolen books served while they were part of the Nazi library. To the forced laborers who had to handle them, they offered moments of intellectual refuge. Arno Nadel enjoyed reading them. Philip Manis was in awe just from catching a glance of them. And Jenny Wilde took pride in working with them, just as she had done for nearly 40 years before. How the forced laborers used the stolen books, the joy they took out of them, subverted the official purpose of the library of the Reichssecurity main office, and shows continuity in the usage of the books even after their theft. This means the end of the Hochschule collection did not come in 1942. It came quietly over the last 80 years, while post-war translocations led to the collection being dispersed worldwide, and it being reduced to its individual books and their value to fill gaps in the collections of the institutions that were at the receiving end of the translocation. I come to the end of my presentation and to the broader implications of my argument. What does the fate of the Hochschule collection mean? What can we learn from the case of the Hochschule Library for general library history? The extended period of ending of the Hochschule collection, its afterlife and resurfacing remind me of a very visual notion that Peter Stein presented to describe the relation between real and imaginary libraries. I quote, "Vanished libraries are admittedly not there anymore, but they continue to exist as stories, and therefore they are quite real for the concept of the library. One can go even further and formulate, in the end, all existing libraries are actually imaginary, since they are ultimately of limited duration. Just as long-lost monastic libraries continue to exist only through their catalogues, and thus are hardly distinguishable from imaginary libraries with made-up titles and books, so all other libraries will one day vanish. It is a perpetual perishment." The case of the Hochschule Library teaches us that a small but crucial amendment to Stein's notion is necessary. A collection does not simply vanish into nothingness, it vanishes into another collection. It is eliminated but preserved as a part of a larger entity. I'd suggest adopting this notion of a dialectical relation of book collections. It might be fruitful when thinking about library history. It might reveal how dynamic actually is what we think of to be static. It might help sharpen our focus for the barbaric violence, as Peter Stein calls it, the violence that drives this dialectical relation and that rests coiled up underneath the surface of the collections that surround us. Thank you.